talk a little bit more about the internal audit function. This is going to permeate throughout the entire exam. I really think it's always good to talk more about them. In assessing the competence of a client's internal audit function, an auditor would consider the internal audit team's compliance with so there are some things that we would consider and not consider. Instead of listing out all of the many things we wouldn't care about, here are the things we would care about. Is the internal audit team compliant with professional internal auditing standards, just like us as external auditors? Are we compliant with external auditing standards? Do they have a solid educational background and professional certifications? I would very much trust more in using the work of clients' internal audit function. I would trust the work more of those who have all worked for 10 years in the field, maybe have different certifications. Maybe some are CPAs, maybe some are certified internal auditors, versus a team of people who all just got hired this year and have never worked in the industry before. Hey, everyone's got to start somewhere, but that's why we have this staggered approach where you work with others who have worked in the industry and you gain your experience that way. The quality of audit plans, procedures, and documentation. So you just review their work, and if you think that they plan well and they execute well and they document their work well, that would give them credibility, the competence, and you'd be able to trust that you can use their work more. In assessing the objectivity of a client's internal audit function. So you want to assess if they are competent and if they are objective. Now again, they're essentially paid by the company. How objective can you get? Probably not 100%. But they should be as objective and independent as possible. Yeah, Microsoft internal audit team is getting their paychecks from Microsoft, so that's why we hire the external auditors. What are we going to consider here? Well, we're going to consider the organizational level to which the internal audit function reports and the organizational status of the director of internal audit, meaning we're going to look at org charts to make sure that these people are as independent from management as possible, that they report directly to the board of directors. We're also going to assess policies which prohibit the work between internal auditors and relatives in key management positions. If you are working for the internal audit department and your spouse works in the management position, that could be a serious red flag. All right, what about continuing using the work of the internal audit function? And also, can the internal audit function help us to do our audit? The answer is yes, and we'll talk about that, particularly throughout other lessons. But essentially, can the internal auditors help us? Well, we're not going to just give our entire job as the external auditor over to the client and make them do it themselves. But they could do things like help us with calculations. They would never help us with subjectivity or anything that requires judgment. That is up to us as the external auditor. But if we need them to collect documents for us, or prepare a little check on a work paper, that's totally fine. Once the auditor makes a positive assessment of the internal audit function's objectivity and competence, so once we assess that, okay, we can trust them enough because they're objective and they're competent, the auditor can rely on the internal audit team's work. Again, in specifics and in practice, it very much depends. So when there's direct assistance provided by the internal auditor on the audit, the external auditor should supervise, review, evaluate, and test any work they do. Just like if you were the manager and you wanted to make sure that your staff associate was actually doing good work, you would supervise their work, review it, evaluate it, and test it. The external auditor can rely on internal audit's tests. So this is what I was talking about, subjectivity, such as tested controls for their own assessment of control risk. However, the external auditor cannot rely on internal audit's assessment of control or inherent risk, as these are areas with high degree of subjectivity. To go over this again, you can rely upon their tests of internal controls, but not of their assessment. You make the assessment based on their work. Big difference. They could be the ones to test the cash process, the inventory process, accounts payable process, but you are the one using those tests to make an assessment. If internal audit says, yeah, we think control risk is at 2%, doesn't matter, don't even listen to them. Not that they're untrustworthy, but that's your job. That's what you're being hired for. And that would be irresponsible of you not to do that. The less subjective an area is, the more an auditor can rely on it. So the more objective it is. If the internal audit function is counting up numbers saying 1 plus 2 plus 3 equals 6, we can rely on that. But if the internal audit function is saying, we believe that the estimated value of this PP&E, this piece of equipment, is at $10 million, we probably cannot rely on that, and we should do that ourselves. We should check that and provide an estimate ourselves. Some other subjective areas, including estimates, materiality. You alone, and we'll talk about this in the materiality section, you alone as the external auditor are responsible for materiality. You need to determine that materiality, and you cannot do that with any influence from the client. That's super important, and you don't communicate that to the client. Materiality, you keep that under wraps. You don't want any influence from the client there. Subjectivity, materiality, estimates, valuation, existence of contingencies, which is subjective also. Should we accrue for something? Are we going to actually have to pay out this liability? Is it more likely than not? Some common areas where the internal auditors can provide more direct assistance would be understanding of internal control. So you're just asking them, okay, once this report's generated, who is it sent to? Or once cash is received from the mailroom, who deposits it to the bank? Those would be totally valid things to trust the internal auditors on. And performing substantive testing. You can trust them to do substantive testing. Additionally, this could be any other testing that's not critical to the audit that the auditor really should be doing themselves. The auditor's got to do work themselves. You're not going to just rely upon them to do absolutely everything, right? Just because you were hired to do that. But also, let's just say management said, sure, let the internal audit do everything. No, you cannot fully trust absolutely everything, as we talked about right here in this paragraph. The internal audit team has a more comprehensive plan, which is more detailed and covers more areas than those that an external auditor would do. And that makes sense because the internal auditor, 365 days a year, the whole year, works for that one company. You as the external auditor probably have multiple audit clients, and you're not doing that full year. Maybe you're just doing the audit for 3 months of the year, or even, smaller firms, maybe a week. You're doing an audit in a month. As such, the internal audit team should have a more comprehensive plan. But you as the external auditor, your job is to detect material misstatements. Internal audit is trying to make sure the company as a whole is running well. Internal auditors work for the client and are fully focused on that one entity and not subjected to materiality. So internal audit would investigate $3 differences or $100 stolen, whereas we wouldn't really care about that as the external auditor because that is probably well below materiality.
Hey there! Are you ready to not only pass your CPA exams, but truly understand and enjoy the material while studying? I know it seems impossible, right? Especially to enjoy the material? We'll do it together. Tap into the power of CPA.examprep.ai, where we've got personalized quizzes, multiple choice questions, memorization guides, flashcards, simulations, all tailored to your learning. Our adaptive study planning puts you on the fastest path to success and lifts you back up if you fall behind. Avoid wasting your precious time and money attempting an exam with a low chance of passing, because who wants that? We want to get you through this process as quick as possible. Our exam readiness prediction lets you walk in with confidence, knowing that you're prepared for success on exam day. Thankfully, there's no payment method needed to get started, so why don't you come join us? Visit cpa.examprep.ai and let's achieve your exam success together.